Yeah, no. So last year I was learning a lot of languages, which for something that I said earlier wasn't part of the degree. I was, my degree contained 6 or 7 languages last year, and I had a great time learning that.
Yeah.
But I don't want to give anyone the false impression that in order to study linguistics you have to be studying 6 or 7 languages, because it's not like any of my exams had a translation question or anything like that. So it's more about understanding how they work, and those are pretty general skills that you can apply once you figure out how a language works. So for me, that was really rewarding. So the opportunity to study Sanskrit and Gothic and Old Norse and Old English and Latin and Greek, you wouldn't really get the opportunity to focus on that in that same level of depth within the linguistics faculty. And you wouldn't be taught by people who specialize in those areas. So it's really great that there's the opportunity for kind of cross collaboration between those departments.
Hi everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We have a new guest with us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tom. I'm a third year linguistics student here at Trinity Hall. So that's the final year of my course. I'll be graduating this summer.
Nice. So today we're going to be talking about the linguistics course at Cambridge, going through the course content and what it's like studying the course, and how it overlaps with other similar courses. So Thomas, for anyone who's unsure, what is linguistics?
So linguistics, in a short sentence, is the study of language. So compared to studying languages like people do in school or in courses like MML, linguistics is more about studying language as a singular phenomenon rather than focusing on any particular language at any given time, though there are linguists that do that as well. But it's about studying how language works, how it fits into the world, how it fits into humanity and people's brains, lives, etc. So anything language does, really, linguists study.
Interesting. So this might sound like a dumb question, but for anyone who hears that and thinks, well, what's the difference between I don't know, like studying English and linguistics? Because I think a lot of people might assume studying English language is the same as studying language.
Yes. Well.
Yeah. It's fine. You can ignore them.
People who study English language, you might have studied that at A-level. That's probably the closest you can come to studying linguistics before studying it at university, with the exception that, unlike English language, linguistics doesn't have a focus point of just one language. So obviously you can study English linguistics, which is close to English language and how that works. But yeah, sorry, what was the question again?
Is studying English the same as studying linguistics? Because I think some 16, 17-year-olds will, if you say studying linguistics is studying language, they will think that that's the same as studying English.
Yeah, so not really. So, I mean, in a functional sense, the biggest difference between linguistics and English specifically is the literature. So people who go and study an English degree will spend most of their time reading literature and discussing literature and what happens in that literature, whereas linguistics sticks to discussing the language itself. So while obviously you can use literature as a reference point for getting language, you won't read a book and talk about what happens in the book. You will, you might discuss how language is used or anything interesting about a specific language, whether that be in literature or not. But it's more focused on language generally.
Maybe we've got a bit later on, but we could talk about it now. talk about the first year course and what you learn in linguistics. 'Cause I think that might show the viewers how different it is to the course content that you would study if you were doing English. So what kind of things would a linguist study in their first year at Cambridge?
Yeah, so first year here, because no one's expected to have studied linguistics at school before. The first year is about kind of establishing a foundation and giving everyone the same footing for specializing in later years. So every year in linguistics, you study 4 papers, and in first year, those papers cover most of the fundamental areas of the subject. So there's the first paper, which covers phonology, phonetics, and morphology. So that's, those 3 together kind of cover sounds and how words are formed. The second paper covers semantics, pragmatics, and syntax. So that's how sentences are constructed and how grammar is formed on a sentence level, and then also meaning, both of words and of larger sentences and conversations. The third paper introduces psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, language acquisition, as well as sociolinguistics and computational linguistics. So that's moving into more of the area of what we call applied linguistics, which is taking the study of language and using it in a practical sense. So how language is in the mind and in the brain, and how you can use the conclusions from that to talk about society, how language fits into society, and using computers and machines to how they interact with language and how you can use them in stuff like large language models, artificial intelligence, and kind of machines that work with language computationally.
Nice, interesting.
Oh, and then the fourth paper is the histories and varieties of English. So you study Old English and I think also Middle English still, as well as how English varies and changes in the modern day. So dialects and languages based on English like Creoles, and how English has changed and interacted with other languages over the course of history. So you get dialectology, historical linguistics, as well as a small degree of philology in the study of Old English as well.
Wow. So how, how does linguistics help with learning other languages? Because it sounds like, I don't know, it sounds like there's a lot of other languages or the beginnings of other languages in the course.
Yeah. I mean, in a sentence, linguistics isn't about learning languages, and it's not part of the course. So you don't need to speak any other languages to be able to do linguistics, and it will never be a requirement. But in a degree that focuses so much on language generally, most people will end up learning in one way or another about a language that isn't their mother tongue. So that's kind of the reason why every first year has to dabble in Old English a bit, because that just kind of forces you to have a new perspective on how language changes and how it's used. And the way that we learn Old English and the way that we use Old English isn't the same as it would be in, say, your French GCSE class, in that you're not learning the language to be able to converse with people in it. Of course, no one speaks Old English, but more to learn how it works and why it works the way it does. And that it's a very good kind of reference point for discussion.
How did you find the Old English part of the course in the first year?
I really enjoyed it. That's kind of my area. So I study historical languages and language change, particularly Germanic languages like Old English. So that was always my cup of tea. But for people that aren't as keen on the prospect of learning Old English, it's still a very small part of first year and not something that you have to follow through with in subsequent years if it's not really your area.
Nice. So am I right in thinking, so for someone who like myself, who like no experience in linguistics, when I'm like reading something, I will I guess, just read it and understand what I do. But if you come from a linguistics background, will you also be able to understand how the language is constructed as well as reading it like anyone else?
In a sense, yeah. I definitely find that having an education in linguistics immediately forces you to see every instance of language in a different, deeper way. So yeah, you can look at modern English, and if you know Old English, then that automatically gives you a lot more information on where all of it has come from and how it's changed over time. So when we look at Old English in first year,
Sorry, that
Yeah.
anyone can hear that. There's just a lot of construction apparently happening today.
yeah, great.
That you were saying, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, how we learn Old English in first year is, say in the exam, you're given a text that's written in Old English, and the point of it is not to say, translate this or talk about what's happening, but it's instead to say, talk about what's interesting about the language in this specific text, and that could be the dialect of Old English that's being used, or specific aspects of the grammar or the vocabulary that are noteworthy within the context of Old English as a language. And once you've developed that kind of skill, you can use it on any kind of text, really. So you could look at writing in modern English, and you're forced to think, that, I don't know, word is historically interesting, or the way that sentence is constructed is unusual or not unusual, and how might an author have used that for a specific purpose. That kind of branches more into the study of literature, and that's less the point of linguistics, but it definitely forces you to think harder about language, and with that being something that's around us all the time, it's a very useful skill to have.
Nice. That is interesting. Okay, I'm just going to take a short break because that drumming.
Yeah.
This is the first time that we've had such loud construction, so we've just been quite unlucky. So something we'll say, you were mentioning before we record the podcast is how like students unsure, like sometimes ask like what's like the point of studying linguistics.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pose that question to you.
Well, everyone will kind of have their own reason for studying something, and a subject like linguistics, unlike say medicine or engineering, will never be tied to a specific profession or thing you can do with it in life. So I'd say for most people, the reason they study linguistics is a passion for the subject and a passion for language. So it's definitely about cultivating interest, but the point of the field, rather than just say doing a degree in it, is absolutely to find out what language is, how it works, how it fits into society, how it fits into history, how it fits into the present day. And you can use that in a lot of different ways. So you could use it for language teaching. You can take a lot of the conclusions that people have found through study of linguistics and apply that in a straightforward sense in a French classroom in a school, because you can objectively draw better conclusions about how people learn languages, and because of that, the ways that it's better to teach. But also, language in society, people can go into, say, politics and discuss or evaluate the way that people use language in political campaigns, and how that influences people psychologically and on a societal level, or history, and discuss how a language in the present day has kind of got to where it is. And that's, language has been ever present through human history. So as a tool, understanding it kind of unlocks a lot of doors. It's really kind of, linguistics is what you make of it, and everyone will find a direction in which to take study of the subject that feels right for them, and it's definitely applicable in a lot of different disciplines.
In terms of the applied sides right now, and that especially the fact that there is a computational linguistics module, I imagine there's a big overlap with linguistics and AI.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, large language models like ChatGPT and similar ones have really been at the center of linguistic discussion, and linguists have been central to their development because, I mean, it's the first time we're getting something that isn't a human, arguably, learning a language. So it's the job of linguists who study how humans learn languages and how language works to collaborate with people like computer scientists to figure out how you make those roads meet, how you make a computer learn something that is human. So computational linguists, and everyone gets an introduction to that now in their first year, definitely prepares people for taking the skills that they learn and applying them in all sorts of contexts when it comes to computers and machines. So everyone gets introductions to kind of programming and implementing language into computational models.
Nice. Yeah, and for anyone who's been watching a lot of these podcasts, Marcus, our director of admissions, he's had a lot of experience in his past with AI and computational linguistics. He did it in linguistics undergrad, and hopefully we'll get him on to talk about that, because that'd be really interesting to hear the research behind AI before it became big in the past couple of years. So moving on towards what the course offers at Cambridge, when I was having a look at this, I was just quite amazed by the breadth of the linguistics course at Cambridge. It just seems like it offered everything. So just for the viewers, I'm going to list out, these are the Section C and Section D modules. So these are second and third year modules.
Yeah, so how Cambridge degrees are structured is Part 1 and Part 2. And in linguistics, the Part 2 is 2 years, which means that second and third years all draw from the same pool of papers, which is great actually when you're in second year, because then you're working with people who have an extra year of experience with you, but they're not necessarily at any explicit advantage because you're still learning the same stuff at the same time. So it definitely gives people the freedom to kind of create their own path through the different areas of linguistics.
Oh, that's really cool. I don't know how many other courses have an experience like that where you're mixing with the third years and different. You can choose when to do the courses, whether in your second year or third year. That's really cool. So before I list out the papers that are the modules that are on offer, the course might change by the time that you're applying, as it subtly does change every year. So do bear that in mind. But so the list of modules that there are in your second and third year that you can take in linguistics, there's phonetics, phonology and morphology, syntax, semantics and pragmatics, historical linguistics, history of ideas on language, history of the English language, history of the French language, first and second language acquisition, language learning and cognition, language typology and cognition, computational linguistics. So that's section C. And
so those are the papers that are offered by the linguistics faculty.
Okay.
So those are kind of taught by linguists within the department, and those are definitely the kind of core papers. And then section D is papers offered by external departments and faculties that we can kind of borrow into and still form part of the degree, but they're not affiliated or marked or assessed by the department, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So these papers I'm about to list out are papers from other departments, but you do take as a part of the linguistics course.
Yeah, well, you can choose to take them.
You can choose to take them. Okay. So, I'll list them out first, and then we can talk about which combinations you can do. So, and this list is phenomenal. So, the language of Italy, the Hispanic languages, the history of the Russian language, German, a linguistics introduction, the Romance languages, Celtic philology, elements of comparative linguistics, Greek in the Bronze Age, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this.
There's the history of Latin paper, which that one.
Thank you. Germanic philology, the French language, variation and change, structure and varieties of Italian, comparative.
Semitic linguistics.
Thank you. And Chinese linguistics. So, I mean, Chinese linguistics, I think just is. I mean, I think it's for anyone who has a curious mind and is curious about language. The world is your oyster with this course.
Definitely.
So, can you shed us a bit of light on? So, after you've done your first year and you have these 2 sections, what kind of combinations can you do, and what is typical?
Well, in theory, you can do any combination, but it's probably best to ground yourself in the core linguistics papers that are offered by the faculty, because in third year you take linguistic theory, which is another paper, and that's a kind of general paper that's to do more with theoretical debates within the field of linguistics. And if you've borrowed all of your papers from different faculties, then you're not going to be in as good of a position to engage with linguistics debates. And also, if you've borrowed all of your papers from different faculties, kind of why you're doing a linguistics degree, because for most people, there will absolutely be the majority of their interest will be covered by the papers offered within the department. But people who want to branch out into a specific language or a specific style of studying linguistics might find that that's offered by a paper in another department. So the Section C papers tend to cover a more advanced version of the topic that's introduced in first year. So the papers like phonetics and phonology are introduced in LI1 in first year, and then those are expanded upon in more detail and by covering more kind of cutting edge theoretical approaches to those fields in the more advanced papers in second and third year. But then there's also some new ones introduced, like language typology, which is kind of covered in a sense by studying English dialect variation in first year, but takes a much more global approach. And then the borrowed papers, those are from varying combinations of MML, classics, AMES, and ASNC.
And what does it, just if anyone doesn't know those abbreviations?
Oh, yes. So that's modern medieval languages. So the languages course. ASNC is Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic. AMES is Asian and Middle Eastern studies. And classics is Latin and Greek.
Nice.
Yeah. So from the MML faculty, you can borrow, well, basically from all of these faculties, what we're able to borrow is their linguistics papers. So linguists aren't able to borrow the papers from, for example, MML, where you study a language's literature or film or anything like that, which is kind of the main difference between us and those degrees, in that we are only allowed to focus on the study of the language itself. So you're able to borrow, say, history of German or a linguistic introduction to German, because those papers don't cover any actual literature. And that means that linguists are very much on an even footing with people from those departments. And even though it will be a mixed cohort in the paper between MMLers, for example, and linguists borrowing the paper, everyone is kind of able to approach it in the same way, albeit from different perspectives. So I borrowed 2 of my papers last year, which is a comparatively large number for the department. So I borrowed Germanic philology from ASNC and elements of comparative linguistics from classics. And in both of those papers, people from the ASNC department and the classics departments haven't done much linguistics themselves. So for them, those papers are a kind of introduction to linguistics. And for us, the papers are kind of an introduction to those more specialized fields. So I've been able to focus on, within the classics paper, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Proto-Indo-European, kind of the languages that classicists focus on, and how linguistics is done on those languages. And then in ASNC, Old Norse, Old English, Old High German, Gothic, Germanic languages, basically, and how those are taught and how those are learned about, but without, say, doing literary commentary.
That's really cool. It's also really cool that in your second year you managed to cover both like Germanic, Old English languages and classics as well.
Yeah. No. So last year I was learning a lot of languages, which for something that I said earlier wasn't part of the degree. I was, my degree contained 6 or 7 languages last year, and I had a great time learning that.
Yeah.
But I don't want to give anyone the false impression that in order to study linguistics you have to be studying 6 or 7 languages, because it's not like any of my exams had a translation question or anything like that. So it's more about understanding how they work, and those are pretty general skills that you can apply once you figure out how a language works. So for me, that was really rewarding. So the opportunity to study Sanskrit and Gothic and Old Norse and Old English and Latin and Greek, you wouldn't really get the opportunity to focus on that in that same level of depth within the linguistics faculty. And you wouldn't be taught by people who specialize in those areas. So it's really great that there's the opportunity for kind of cross collaboration between those departments. But also last year I took LI17, language typology, and in that paper, as part of the course, you kind of adopt a language to focus on that you base your typological study in. And typology is basically the study of the full extent of variation in the world's languages, and you're specifically encouraged to choose a language that is kind of unfamiliar to you. So don't choose a language from Europe, don't choose one you speak already or is kind of similar to one that you speak already. I chose Cree, which is a Native American language spoken in Canada. Nice. It's the largest First Nations language that's spoken in Canada, and is very distinct from the behavior of most of the languages that people are familiar with in Europe, say. So it was really great to kind of adopt a very new perspective in my study with that. That's one of the few linguistics papers where you can sink your teeth into a language should you choose to as well. So that it was great to kind of get that opportunity to study and engage with so many different languages over the course of that 1 year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, I'm just going to restart the cameras. Do you know Martin AMES? So this is a very random question.
Should I?
No. He's a British writer, and when in interviews he always talks a lot about language and sentence structures. Just you look very like and sound exactly like.
Right. Maybe there's just a type of linguists then.
So this is, I was just wondering if you knew. Yeah, I think there is an uncanny similarity,
right,
which is just very cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. And if anyone wants to know more about the modules and the course choice that the linguistics course offer at Cambridge, they can find all of this information in the faculty website.
Yeah. And those are updated as the course changes over time. Obviously, with it being such a small department, certain papers will come and go as academics do. So I mean, it's great that we've always got courses taught by people who specialize in those areas. So as the course content or as different courses change slightly over time, then that'll be updated on the website. So you can look for that.
Nice. Yeah, I think you just need to type Department of Linguistics, Cambridge, and then you'll find all of this information. So moving towards the life of a linguist student at Cambridge and what the teaching is like. What does the life of a linguistics student look like at Cambridge?
I'd say it's actually quite varied based on the kind of linguist that you are and what year you're in. But in first year, you're taking 4 papers, 4 papers a year every year. In first year, that's pretty straightforward in that you'll have 1 lecture a week for each subject. So 4 lectures, pretty light load compared to most subjects at Cambridge. And then you'll have supervisions for each of those papers that run throughout the term. and you'll have work set for those. So even though you're spending less time in the lecture hall or in the supervision room, you're spending most of the rest of that time reading and writing essays or doing exercises, depending on the kind of paper that you're doing.
Can you expand what kind of exercises?
Yeah, so for subjects like, say, phonetics or phonology, in first year you might be given transcription tasks, or you might be given, by which I mean, say you might be told, listen to this recording of someone speaking, talk about how they're speaking, talk about this vowel that they've used or this consonant and the way they've said it, or can you figure out where the person's from? Can you figure out anything about the person based on how they sound and the way they speak? You might also be given data from a language that you've never heard of or that you have heard of, and told to talk about the grammar and how it appears to work, or the sounds. In a subject like syntax, you might be given a sentence and told to analyze the structure of it. So those aren't things that lend themselves very well to an essay, but you'll definitely get your fair share of essay-based and non-essay-based exercises, depending on what areas you choose to focus on.
Just on there, but this is a bit of a tangent, but does like exercises like that or the linguistics course help someone like understand how poetry is constructed more?
It might do to an extent. That falls more into the area of literary analysis. So I know people in, say, the English faculty or classics will spend time analysing the history and development of poetic technique. But you can absolutely, linguistics could definitely help you address the question of what is a rhyme, how does rhyming work from a new perspective, and why do people rhyme things, or alliteration or other kind of methods that have been used throughout history to create poetry in its different forms. In my Germanic philology paper, I studied a couple of poems in Old High German, which is the ancestor of most of the modern German dialects, and because in that period of history, most of the remnants we have of those dialects are in things like poetry, because they tend to be preserved quite well even without being written down. So linguists, well, depending on the type of linguist they are, most will engage with poetry at some point in their study if they're studying, say, a historical form of a language that has a poetic tradition. So I specialize in historic Germanic languages, and there's plenty of poetry about in those.
Nice. So going back to the course, and so there's the lectures, and the work you'll do for the supervisions, whether it's exercises or essays. Are there? I think that are there labs in linguistics?
Yeah, well, we have a lot of different things that are called labs, depending on, again, what area you're in. So last year I took phonetics, and we have a phonetics lab, which is an actual lab, so to speak. It's a separate room that has specialized equipment for recording or for transcribing speech. So in my kind of phonetics lab sessions, we would go in and you're instructed in a software called Prat, which basically shows you like the waveform of someone speaking and allows you to go in and kind of snip that up and look about how, the way you make speech sounds, how that's reflected in the actual waveform that is produced. So you come out with a pretty cool skill, that you're able to look at a spectrogram and snip it up and say,
That's right.
Yeah, you're able to, if someone gives you a spectrogram, a kind of visual representation of the waveform of someone speaking, you're able to snip that up and figure out what's being said, which is interesting. Then there's also labs in, there's practicals as well. So there's practicals and labs and seminars depending on the paper that you take. And those are all kind of on a spectrum of non-lectured but participatory sessions. So in seminars and practicals, you're being taught something, but you're able to kind of raise questions and participate. You might go up and do some exercises or collaborate with other people and tackle a question within those labs or within those practicals in the way that you wouldn't in a lecture. So we, depending on the paper you're taking, have sessions for people to try out the practical skills that you use and that you learn within those papers.
Just hearing about those labs and the practicals, it sounds like some of the similar stuff that the students do in the psychology and behavioural sciences course at Cambridge. I wanted to ask, like, is there much of an overlap between the linguistics course and psychology?
I don't think there is anymore.
Okay.
I know that to the behavioural psychology department, language is a pretty big focus of theirs. And there's lots of linguists who work in psycholinguistics within the linguistics department. So that's not really my area. There may be overlap between those departments. And I think there used to be some borrowing of papers between linguistics and psychology, but there isn't for the time being, at least. That may come back at a later date.
So in terms of the course, there's no borrowing of papers between the two departments, but is there an overlap between, I guess, linguistics and
psychology? There's definitely an overlap in material. Psycholinguistics is kind of language in the mind, and then there's also neurolinguistics, which is language in the brain. So people who focus on those areas, and honestly, you can't really go through a linguistics degree without interacting quite heavily with psycholinguistics in one way or another. So even though I haven't taken the psycholinguistics or the language acquisition papers, studying, for example, phonology, psycholinguistics serves as evidence for most of the kind of theoretical claims that can be made in phonology, for example. In that, how do we know that these two sounds are different? Or you can conduct a psychological experiment and see if people use them differently, or see if they're processed or stored differently in the brain. So there's definitely an overlap, and psychology is definitely pervasive throughout linguistics.
No, it's interesting. And you were talking about the seminars. It's just for any viewers who are unsure, can you explain the difference between the seminars and the supervisions that linguistic students experience?
So the kind of seminar lab practical type of session will be larger with all or most of the students taking a paper, whereas a supervision is a much smaller, more focused group where you will be set work to complete and usually discuss and go over during the course of the supervision. So the size of them will vary depending on what year you're in and what paper you're taking. In first year, they tend to be on the larger side for Cambridge, so it might be in a group of up to 5 or 6.
And this is for linguistics?
This is for linguistics, yeah. In first year. I know other subjects have smaller ones, but that depends on student size and staff and stuff like that. So yeah, in first year, you're in larger groups, and you'll be set essays or exercises, and then you go in and you discuss those topics with your supervisor. You might discuss the work, and it's about kind of building the skills of good academic practice, like writing good essays or being able to analyze a question and being able to do a practical exercise or a problem sheet, and then kind of take the work that you've done and discuss it. In second and third year, the groups will be smaller, so maybe sizes of 1 to 3, depending on the paper you're taking. And then again, you come in and discuss the work with your supervisor, but because there's fewer people, it will be under more scrutiny. But by that time, you're definitely kind of prepared for that approach, and it's good to be able to be challenged, and be forced to back up the points you've made when you've written an essay, or to defend the choices you've made if you're doing an exercise sheet.
I guess the teaching's a lot more focused and individual when the supervisions are just you and another student with the academic.
Absolutely. Yeah. So supervisions can also be a great way to discuss kind of points of contention in a course. If there's something that you don't quite understand, whether you know that or your supervisor knows it, then the supervision's a great place to say, I understand most of, say, what I was writing about in this essay, but there's this one bit in the reading or in the lecture that just doesn't quite make sense to me. Could you help me understand that and implement it? Then they're the great way to kind of get that knowledge and learn how to use it in a way that's more focused on the individual.
Nice. And in linguistics, do students have a chance to do a dissertation? And if so, like, what's your diss on?
Yeah, everyone does a dissertation in their third year, so that's part of your 4 papers in third year. Yeah, everyone takes 4 papers a year, but in third year, one of them is linguistic theory, which is a general paper, and 1 paper is your dissertation. So thankfully, that doesn't mean that you're having to do the usual workload and writing a dissertation. In the dissertation workload is generally considered to be kind of equivalent to one of the papers that you're taking. My dissertation falls mostly within the subject area of historical linguistics, and I am applying and evaluating a new methodology of historical language grouping to the Sami languages, which is a group of languages that are spoken in northern Scandinavia and Russia.
Okay.
So there's 10 languages, and historically there's kind of been some contention on how do you approach discussing the structure of that language family. How are they related to each other? Can you say that any 2 languages are more related than others? And does that reflect in their kind of historical closeness to each other, or is it representative of the current situation? So phylogenetics in historical linguistics, to use a very long word, is very similar to the same field in, for example, biology, in that for a long time people have described language families that they know to be related with, say, a branching tree. So the Indo-European language family is large and very well known, and that spans everything from English to Latin, German, Greek, Hindi, Sanskrit, Russian, and all of those are related in one way or another eventually. And a lot of people have, say, analyzed those relationships with a tree, and that you can say, well, the first point, the 2 groups of languages that are the most different can be represented with the initial branching of groups A and B. A lot of linguists, including myself, view representing history like that as inherently problematic when it comes to languages, because unlike, say, biological species, that you can say, well, these 2 split off at a specific point, and once you have 2 species, they don't interact. It's not like they can merge again at a later point in time. Though if they can, that's not a question for me to answer. That's that is biology. But languages, you can never really decide when a language has split into 2 languages. At what point can you say, well, all of the variation that you see in English in the current day, is that 1 language? Is that many? Latin at one point was varied enough that you now end up with French and Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. And at what point do you decide that, well, that's a tree that's been split up in this way? Because those languages and all those dialects will still kind of be geographically next to each other. The people who speak them will be in contact. So it's a much fuzzier picture, I think, than can be represented with straight lines on a page. And I'm applying a new methodology that I think better represents that, though the point of my dissertation is as much to use it as it is to evaluate it and critique it and figure out its place in the kind of modern approach to historical language study. And I think that the Sami languages of northern Scandinavia are a really good case with which to apply this, because they've traditionally struggled to be represented with a tree, because the kind of continuum of dialects across that area of northern Europe is, you get a lot of kind of interlacing of different speech varieties. And well, I certainly hope that the conclusions that I reach paint a more accurate picture of those languages.
Oh, so that's really cool. So, am I right in thinking is that there's this like family where you can put different languages in depending on the different groups that already exist. There's some languages that don't necessarily fit into the groups, and your thesis is highlighting the limitations of this family, and then you're trying to explain where they should be placed.
Well, I'm highlighting the limitations of the approaches that linguists have taken in the past. There's no limitations to the family itself, in the sense that that's just the way it is. I can't change the relatedness or the non-relatedness of various dialects, but it's our job as linguistic students to be able to analyze it as accurately as possible and describe it as accurately as possible. And if the methods used don't represent the truth, then you need to evaluate the methods and come up with new ones.
Nice. Just quite curious. Like, has your interests in linguistics changed from when you started the course compared to now?
I don't know. My personal experiences have always been pretty focused in that I've known that I like historical linguistics. I've always enjoyed thinking about and learning about how languages change over time, how they're related to each other, how they contact with each other, and how those instances of contact create changes that can be seen throughout history. But the courses I've taken and the papers I've taken throughout my degree have definitely shaped my focuses within that area. So the Germanic philology paper that I took from ASNC was a great way to focus just on a specific language family in history, and in that you learn both how those languages, like Old English and Gothic, Old Norse, are related to each other, and also how their individual histories have shaped the features of those languages. So I focus specifically on Old Norse, and well, I plan on going on to postgraduate study, and my plan there is researching actually how Old Norse and the Sami languages, despite being unrelated to each other, they share a kind of geographic area, how contact between those two language groups have mutually influenced features across different areas of those language families.
Wow, that is really interesting. Sorry, there's more drilling that you can hear, if you can hear that. I'm also just curious, because I think the viewers will want to know, like what reasons you got, how come you chose linguistics as a course, and was it like a direct link to like your A-level choices as well?
Not particularly, in that, well, you can't study linguistics before doing a degree in it, unfortunately, and there's no required A-level subjects or anything in order to study the course. So at A-level I took English, music, and computer science, which is a very varied span of different disciplines, and I enjoyed all of them, but none of them were linguistics. So for me, my A-levels were more about consolidating my interests and
in a way, free languages.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. But linguistics is definitely very multidisciplinary, and there's people who come and study it that have taken, maths, further maths, physics, chemistry. They're very on the STEM side of things. There's people who come who've studied English and history and geography, and they're very much on the humanities side of things. But everyone's ultimately on an even footing once the course begins, because regardless of kind of where your academic foundations lie, you've still got to learn everything you know plus an entire new way of thinking, regardless of what that is, because the discipline is so broad. As far as what got me into linguistics personally, I can't really say. I know I've been into it for a long time, certainly since I was, 13, 14. But to me, it was always kind of a hobby. I loved learning about different languages. I'd go on Wikipedia and I'd read about them, or I'd read about specific areas of linguistics like phonology or phonetics, and sounds were always so cool.
Yeah.
You hear a language for the first time and you think, wow, why does it sound the way it sounds? Why is that interesting? And that's what those questions have always interested me. I never kind of clocked on to the fact that I could actually do a degree in it until much later. Actually, I'd done a presentation to my English GCSE class, I think, that was about historical linguistics, and my English teacher came and told me, have you considered doing a degree in this? And genuinely, until that point, I had never thought of doing it. So I think there'll absolutely be people that think language is cool, and whether they like, say, the languages that they might study at GCSE or A level, or they actually don't. I was never particularly good at my GCSE French, for example, and look at me now. But
Nice.
There'll be people who find language cool, and linguistics is definitely the opportunity to kind of enjoy yourself learning about language, and the more you learn about it, the cooler it gets. It's not that when you start learning about how language actually works at a higher level, suddenly it all makes sense and it gets boring. It actually gets more interesting, I find. So it's definitely been great to keep that fire burning and kind of fuel the passion.
Nice, yeah. I mean, it sounds like one of those courses that you open one door and there's 10 more to open.
Definitely.
Which I think is really exciting and really cool. And I think it's that origin story really shows how it's the perfect contingency when your pastime is also the degree that you're choosing.
Yeah, no, and I love every minute of it, because when you do what you love, you don't work, they say.
Yeah, exactly.
So and I know a lot of my friends on the course are like that as well. It's definitely a subject, because it's so niche, it's not a subject that anyone really does on a whim. I don't think a lot of people apply by accident, so to speak. But it's definitely a subject that even if you're not really sure about it, or you don't feel like you know much about it, you can approach it from an angle that is that's familiar to you. I mean, obviously I notice because it's what I pay most attention to, but people talk about language all the time. Most days I will stumble into one discussion or another where people are thinking, oh, that word is interesting, I wonder where that word came from, or the way you said that is interesting, or you've got a cool accent, where are you from? And linguistics gives you the tools to answer those questions properly. And that makes the world more interesting, because once language is interesting, then it's very easy to be entertained, because it's everywhere all the time.
I mean, it's very, I guess, and then I guess you then realize how, like, the difference between when people are communicating with language and when they're communicating without language, which is cool.
And that's, I mean, even communication without language still comes under linguistics. So people who study pragmatics, for example, they study meaning in a sentence sense, in a communicative sense. So semantics is the study of meaning in words. Pragmatics is what you mean when you say something in context. And, raising your eyebrows, smiling, frowning, pointing, that's all still communication, and definitely still comes under language.
Nice, that's really cool. So I'm going to do another break of the cameras.
Of course. Yeah. No, I find I meet a lot of people that once they actually learn what linguistics is, they say, "Oh, I wish I could have studied that. Now I actually know what it is."
Yeah.
So hopefully this will do a job of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I know people who, when they hear that people who are like bilingual, their critical thinkings, they tend to be better critical thinkers because they're aware that people can perceive language, perceive life through different languages.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people who aren't bilingual just don't get that, and then that kind of like, then they don't realise that they're kind of viewing everything through one lens, but there
Definitely.
are different lenses.
Yeah. Well, that's linguistics. That's psycholinguistics. There. That's what people who study language acquisition, whether that's first language acquisition, which is say the first language that you learn, your native language, or second language acquisition, when you're learning a language later in life, they study how that shapes the brain, how that shapes what effects can be seen in people's lives.
Nice, yeah. As for me, sadly, I'm just reminded of how much acquisition I lack when I try to,
Yeah.
when I try to learn French. But it is. I was talking to Marcus, who's obviously like a very successful linguist, and yeah, he agreed that when learning a new language, to see it as learning more of language rather than learning a different language.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's linguists who would argue that the world's languages are more the same than they are different. That's a very big can of worms that I won't open, in this podcast episode. But yeah, I think ultimately linguistics allows you to look at language generally, and for that reason, the difference between English and French doesn't actually seem that great once you see it from the perspective of the whole.
Yeah, sorry.
It's all right. Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. So with applying to linguistics, say I'm a prospective student, no one is doing an A level in linguistics because there isn't one.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for the application, and specifically if I get invited for an interview for linguistics, is there any way that I could prepare for that?
Yeah, no, it can definitely feel daunting when on one hand you know that there's no expectation for having done the subject before, but at the same time you need something to talk about in the interview. So there's a lot of kind of well-known books that people read. For example, Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct is a very popular book that is designed for a general audience, that introduces linguistics and introduces some of the main debates in linguistics, and that's definitely a good way to bridge the gap between just being interested in language and being interested in linguistics. And there's also books you can read, say textbooks about specific subfields of linguistics. So kind of do a bit of research on one area that you think you find most interesting. Or, it can be as simple as starting with reading the Wikipedia page for a language that you speak or a language that you're interested in and find cool, and figuring out why you think it's cool, and then finding a paper or a book that talks about that, and kind of getting engrossed in the way people talk about languages within the study of linguistics.
I was wondering, I know it was a few years ago, but how did you find your interview? Did the preparation help, or was the interview just completely new and unexpected?
Well, I wouldn't call it scary. It was new, and you can never necessarily expect exactly what's going to happen. I really enjoyed my interview. I had a lot of fun, and I think that's important for a lot of people to go into the interview and have fun, because if you like your subject, it will be fun. So I had 2 interviews. The first one was more talking, philosophical. I was asked some general big questions about language. And obviously for that, you don't necessarily need any explicit prep. You don't need to, it's not like you'll find the answers to the question in a book, because those questions were kind of deep. You need to come up with them yourself. And if you're thinking about language in the right way, then you'll be able to answer them. And then the second interview was closer to a kind of aptitude test. It was kind of exercises, linguistics exercises. It was basically stuff that you get in your first year, disguised in a way to get people who haven't done any linguistics in a formal context to do some exercises, just to show how they think about language, to show how they, check that they approach the problems in the right way. And again, you're not going to find the answers to that in any book, so it's not something that anyone needs to read every book that they can find on linguistics in order to be able to do well in the interview. In that, if your way of thinking about language is in the right place, if you're curious about it and you find it interesting, then I think you'll just naturally approach the interviews in the way that will be good for you for getting in.
Nice. So when you were saying you can't find those answers in a book, you have to kind of work them out. Am I right in thinking that for linguistics interviews, that it's not a knowledge test?
No, not at all.
That it's how you think and working it out in the interview kind of process.
Basically, yeah. I'd still say it's necessary to do some reading and engage with the subject first and foremost, because that way you know what you're getting into. But also because while they won't say, what does Steven Pinker talk about in chapter 2 of The Language Instinct, if you know what he talks about in chapter 2 of The Language Instinct, then you can talk about that should there be something relevant, or it might introduce you to a new perspective that you weren't previously aware of, and then you can use that perspective to approach philosophical questions or exercises in an interview, but also in a degree or in your daily life. So it's definitely useful to engage with the subject, but there's no knowledge requirement before getting in.
Nice. Yeah, so it's not about just regurgitating prior knowledge, but any knowledge that you do know, whether it's within the linguistics field or just, I don't want to use the phrase common sense, but just your critical thinking.
It will help, yeah. Definitely. So, yeah, no knowledge expectation, because they teach you that in the course. It's, they know that no one studied it before, and even people who have engaged with linguistics won't have engaged with the whole thing. So first year sets those foundations. So they teach you the knowledge, but your approach, your direction of thinking and your critical thinking need to, they can't teach that. So that will be established in the interview.
Nice. So we have touched on this part already, but wants to go over again, especially for those who are unsure of which course to choice. So with linguistics, there are options to borrow papers from other departments like MML, Classics, ASNC, AMES, and linguistics itself is consistently compared to the English course. Do you have any advice for someone who's really interested in language and they're torn between which of these courses that they should choose?
Yeah. Well, when you consider the breadth of the subjects like English, MML, ASNC, AMES, Classics, they cover a huge range of material, and linguistics is kind of the one thing that sits in the middle and unites them on one side of things. So in a way, linguistics is more focused on specific areas, but in another sense, it's much broader. There's lots of things that you can do in linguistics that you can't do in, say, AMES or classics or English. But at the same time, there's things that you do in those triposes that you can't do in linguistics, specifically literature. So if you study English or classics, you will study literature, but you don't do that in linguistics. I know that depending on the course that you're taking, if it isn't linguistics, that you can borrow either a couple of the first year linguistics papers or a couple of the section C papers for people who are in their part 2 of various courses. So I know that people in classics, for example, they can borrow historical linguistics, they can borrow history of English, but they can't, say, borrow psycholinguistics, because that's way too much of a stretch from the kind of subjects covered within classics, so people kind of won't be prepared for how to approach that. So in the same way that linguists can't borrow every paper that's offered by classics, classics and English and MML can't borrow every paper that's offered by linguistics. So it's more about where you want the foundation of your focus to rest. And for linguistics, that's language generally. For English, it will just be the English language. For ASNC, that will be, well, either a specific language or a group of languages, or literature, depending on, or history, depending on the kind of focus you take in degrees like that. But there is definitely an overlap, and there's room for people who are mostly interested in AMES or ASNC or classics, but want to do a bit of linguistics, to do a bit of linguistics by borrowing a paper in their 3rd or 4th year, depending on the course they're taking.
Nice. I mean, for me, maybe it's because I come from a sciences background, it reminds me of, I guess, like the difference between maths and physics, in that maths is more like foundational, and physics, a lot of it is applied maths, and a lot of it is just its own physics, but it's much easier to go from maths to physics, but much harder to go from physics to then do pure maths.
That's quite, I mean, it's not my area, so I can't really comment.
And I just wanted to ask, and how that relates to this, is it, is it easier to move from linguistics, and then say there's a linguistic student and they realise that they really like the studying about the languages in, I say, like that are taught in the Anglo-Saxon Norse Celtic course, and then specialise in that area, whereas is that a path that students can take?
Well, in all honesty, it's roughly the path I'm taking with my, it's because I specialise in Old Norse. That's something that's mostly under the umbrella of the ASNC faculty here in Cambridge. But because I still, my study is still grounded in linguistics, it's right for me to be based in the linguistics department rather than ASNC. So I believe ASNC specifically, they can't borrow linguistics papers, but linguists can borrow 2 ASNC papers. So it's definitely, because linguistics is so broad, you can definitely go in a lot of directions and to a lot of different departments, whether that be during your degree or for postgraduate studies, say. So there's a lot of people that will start in linguistics generally and then narrow into a specific language or group of languages and end up in a department like MML or AMES, if they focus on the linguistics of a specific language. Or you could end up in, say, psychology if you focus on psycholinguistics and language in the brain. But it's obviously you won't really be able to pivot into literature, because that's kind of the one thing that linguistics doesn't cover. And it's probably harder with a degree that's based in language and literature, like ASNC or MML or English, to pivot into just the language side of it, which is linguistics, but not impossible.
Interesting. So is it known for linguistic students for, like, would they be able to do a master's in something that was related to modern medieval languages or something related to classics like Latin, Greek, as you are doing with going into the ASNC field?
Kind of, yeah. Bearing in mind that, say, the postgraduate courses I'm applying to are still very much within linguistics in an official context. But yeah, depending on the areas and the specializations that a linguist goes into, they can definitely find themselves in a new field, so to speak. Yeah.
So it's quite an important question for prospective students to decide, because I guess which course they choose between these courses that do overlap in at least the linguistic side, but they do send you in different paths that if you were to have a change of heart later on, it would be depending on which path you go down, be difficult to change.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't view that side of academia as overly restrictive, because it's, at the end of the day, it's information, and if you need to know something, you can always learn it.
Yeah.
Another thing is that you can switch to just linguistics part 2 after part 1 of another tripos. I think specifically, for example, MML, after their part 1, which is 2 years, you can then in theory switch to linguistics part 2,
Okay.
in which case in your first year you will take a couple of the first year papers from linguistics, and that allows you to then pivot into linguistics and graduate with a degree in linguistics, depending on the kind of academic background that you've got. But from subjects like English and classics and ASNC, that's not too big of a pivot, so that's definitely something people can do. Within the scope of, say, undergraduate and postgraduate degrees, applying to a degree in, say, classics or English is definitely something you can do with an undergraduate in linguistics, provided that you've specialized in those areas.
Yeah.
So it definitely opens a lot of doors, depending on the kind of research that you want to do and the kind of focuses that you want to take.
Nice. Yeah. This is really eye-opening, probably for me and a lot of people, where linguistics, I think, is normally a term that not many people know a lot about, but then you realize it so overlaps with so much of what people study even at A level.
No, definitely. And yeah, no, as I mentioned earlier, just language is so ever present in daily life that learning about it is something that rewards you very regularly, whether you're in academia or not. You can just, go out into daily life, get a job that isn't, say, related to linguistics, and you'll definitely have skills that no one else has, and kind of be able to approach life and be able to approach problems in a unique way.
Nice. And how have you found studying linguistics at Trinity Hall? Have you had your supervisions from academics here, or have they been from different colleges?
Well, linguistics is a very small subject, so compared to most subjects in the university, which will organise supervisions and stuff like that within colleges because they have enough students. Linguists average out at less than 1 student per college, and there's fewer students per year than there are colleges in the university. So supervisions and teaching and everything is centrally organised by the department. So everyone gets the same education, which is great for separating kind of academic and non-academic lives when it comes to applying for colleges.
Nice.
But my experience at Trinity Hall has been particularly good, in that we are one of the minority colleges that have a linguistics academic in-house,
Yeah.
who is the wonderful Marika Mailer, who teaches me historical linguistics and is my director of studies. Everyone will get a director of studies, and everyone will, have someone to support them academically, regardless of which college they're at. But Trinity Hall has a really great linguistics community, and we have a lot of people who through the years have studied, and we have a lot of postgrads, and there's a really strong community here, and I've had a great time because of that. So even though the education has been the same as everyone else in my cohort across the university, there's been a really great community here in college that I'm thankful for.
Nice. That's really cool. And lastly, last question we've got here is, what different kinds of careers can students go on to do after studying linguistics? So I guess we've talked a lot about academia, but outside of that.
Yeah. Well, I'll preface with a lot of people do go into academia because
okay.
it's such a niche discipline. A lot of people who get into linguistics want to follow through with it and do that professionally. I'm one of those people. But with it being so broad, you can also go into a huge number of different careers that aren't academia. So even if you pivot quite hard into something like law, you do a law conversion course, you're still approaching that with all of the skills that you've acquired with a linguistics degree, which kind of puts you in a different place to most people. A lot of people go into teaching, whether that is teaching a language like English or a foreign language. You can even go into teaching teachers, so to speak. If you're if you're the kind of linguist that studies how people learn languages, you're in a great position not only to teach language but also to teach language teachers. People will go into translation. People might go into diplomatic relations, the Foreign Office. Speech therapy is a common one for people who study phonetics and sounds, in that gives you a great way to approach, say, people with speech impediments, or people learning a new language, or people who've moved around a lot in life that want speech coaching, or maybe actors or something. I don't know. But yeah, there's a wide variety of opportunities within those. People might work for publishing or dictionaries, or journalism. With language being so universal, any job that has anything to do with language, which is most, you're at an advantage for if you can approach that in a unique way, which linguistics gives you the tools to do.
Nice. That's really exciting. I mean, immediately when you said law, I realised you'd be like a phenomenal lawyer. For better or for worse. And then that's consistent with each profession you said, advertising, marketing, communications.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The list goes on. Amazing. Well, unless there was anything else you wanted to say, Thomas.
No, I think I've done my best to do justice to the kind of breadth and depth of the course, and I think it's really important that people who might not have considered it as something they could do with their life or with just 3 years at university, to consider linguistics, because it's definitely an experience that's unmatched by other disciplines, and a place like Cambridge really gives you the opportunity to explore it at its fullest. So I highly recommend it.
It's you've done a really, really good job. Really comprehensive podcast on the degree, and I think a lot of viewers listening to this will find it really interesting, and something they just probably haven't heard about. I mean, I for one only discovered linguistics when I met students who were studying it at university, which at least from a applying for course perspective is literally too late.
No, yeah, it is, and I actually hear semi-regularly of, oh, I wish I'd studied linguistics, or now I know what it is, or now I've met a few linguists. I think that course sounds really cool, which is great for me to hear, obviously. That's a great ego boost. But yeah, no, it's definitely something that it's worth learning about before it's too late. And yeah, it works well even just as a hobby. I can attest to that. So even if you don't do a degree in it, it's still definitely something that's rewarding just to learn about.
Now, for me personally, what I find so exciting and curious about it is how, I think, the more you hear someone talk about linguistics, the more you realise that you can take a step out of language and observe it, and then I think, and not identify with it, and then you have a whole new, like, I think it's easier to improve your critical thinking through that way. Something we were mentioning before.
Definitely, yeah.
And thanks for the viewers for watching. We're going to be doing more podcasts going through hopefully all of the courses that we offer at Cambridge. So stay tuned for that, and do put in the comments if there are any specific courses that you would like us to cover. Nice.
Lovely. Thanks for having me.